Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here on the morning of day 2. We'll get started. And as always, please make all purchasing decisions based on currently available functionality. And we'll keep going on the slides. So we're going to get started with record-triggered flows, best practices, and design patterns. Feedback. So this is really important. We were able to come back. We did a similar presentation last year at TDX because we got enough feedback saying that people liked it. So this is how we decide agendas for future events. This is how we iterate on these presentations. So please absolutely do take the time to give us feedback. That's really going to help us be able to come back here if you like it, or get us out of here if you don't like the presentation. But then you don't have to do the feedback. I'll buy you Starbucks instead. All right.
Hey, everybody. My name is AJ. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a performance engineer on Diana's team. And I've been at Salesforce for about 10 years now, so I'm going to take all the credit for the work that Diana's planned. And I'm going to let her talk about it today.
I do all the talking, AJ does all the work. We're a great team. But yeah, I'm Diana Jaffe. I'm the product manager on Record Triggered Flows. I've been at Salesforce for 4 years. So again, AJ takes a lot more of the credit. And I'm going to talk to you today about our best practices. So let's kick this off. So I've gone out and talked to a lot of customers about record triggered flows. And the number one question, if I had a nickel for every time I got asked this, I could retire and not be here at TDX, but is what is the right number of record triggered flows per object? Is it 1 flow per object? Is it 100? Is it 2? And folks really want me to say a number, and the answer is that it's a little more complicated than that. So when we talk to so many customers across so many different types of businesses and sizes of organization, there just really isn't a single number that fits everyone. So what we just decided to do is kind of go back to the drawing board and say, okay, how would you describe your automation if you were whiteboarding it, if you were documenting what you want to automate for your business users, and then trying to put that into flow. So I think that's the place to start, is to think through what you want to build and then start to think about how you want to structure your automation rather than kind of starting with a perfect rule. Now, that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all and every admin, every flow builder should go in and do their own thing and kind of do it on their own. The thing we heard from everyone universally is that having your approach documented and structured and maintaining that consistency across your organization is very important. So it's less important the specifics of the approach, but how you implement the approach that's going to be really beneficial. So there's a couple different ways that you can approach how you structure your record-triggered automation, and we actually also have a second session later today that's going to dive into this as well. This is also a session that's been previously recorded and broadcast on YouTube on our Automate This platform. So if you can't make it today at 11:30, just down the hall in breakout room 5, then this is something you'll be able to watch either on recordings from this TDX or from the prior recordings. And this is going to be where real-world admins go in and tell you how they solved their individual cases and which kind of design patterns they used. And I think that's really helpful to kind of get your juices flowing and thinking about how you might want to implement things in your organization. So that's a really great way to pair kind of the universal best practices with the real-world challenges. So what we're going to talk about today is some of these different patterns, and whichever you choose to use, what we recommend as best practices or particular gotchas or things that we know a lot of folks have run into when implementing a particular pattern or some particular pros and cons. So we're going to go through what it's like when you put 1 flow per object, which is a little bit like the process builder model, if you're familiar with that. We're going to talk about what happens when you have many flows per object, which is a little like how workflow rules used to do it. So now Flow supports both of those, and we'll talk through the pros and cons of each. We're also going to talk about asynchronous transactions, which is a growing piece of record-triggered automation that more and more users are needing to grapple with, and it has its own set of considerations. And lastly, we'll focus on scheduled flows and scheduled paths, which is sort of related to record-triggered automation a lot of times, and how those interplay, and some best practices we recommend there as well. So starting off with one flow per object, this is going to be very familiar if you've lived in the world of Process Builder, where you had sort of a series of interconnected decisions, or if you come from the world of Apex and you have kind of a global trigger handler. So this is the model that really parallels that inside Flow. So we'll talk about things we recommend if you're going to do this. And the first thing we recommend is that maybe you don't just have one flow per object, particularly for fast field updates. So when we look at the data across all your record-triggered automation, I think it's something like 80% of all transactions maybe are updates to the triggering record. So the record that triggers that's been created or triggers the update. And this is the most common thing, and there are ways we can make this a lot faster and more performant by choosing the option to optimize for fast field updates. This is going to limit the scope of what Flow does to only update those fields, but it's going to give you a lot of significant performance savings. So we don't do any recursion, we're not repeating ourselves basically, and we're bundling the change that you're making in your automation with the change that, say, the user initiated when they updated the field. And AJ is going to talk about what that means.
Yeah, so we actually did performance testing on exactly what Diana said, and we kind of compared all the different tools that we have within the Salesforce automation ecosystem. And you can see on the left-hand side the couple of columns that have tiny, tiny lines.
You can see them.
Are Apex and flows, and before save flows in specific. And on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that Process Builder takes about 150 milliseconds more than before save flows. And that's just to clarify, before save flows and fast field updates are exactly the same thing. And so we recommend, if you're updating any fields on the triggering record that triggered the flow, it would be awesome if you could put everything into a before save flow and use that. And then all the operations that happen after or on objects that are related to that triggering record or actions that you have to take can go in separate flow, in a separate flow. And I think that's all I have.
I wanted to say it was 150 times faster, and AJ was like, just because it's 150 milliseconds faster does not mean that's multiplicative. So
no, it's
this
not.
is why we have performance engineers here and not just PMs. So I do also want to say these are always best practices and overall recommendations. I was talking to somebody yesterday who has a situation where they're probably going to need to move certain record field updates to an after save flow for particular reasons, and kind of keep that in mind throughout. If you're going, well, I think I have an exception, you might. I think the question is, if you always have the exceptions, then maybe take a look at it. So keep that in mind as we go through all of these best practices.
Oh, I do want to call one quick thing. This graph was taken from the Architect's Guide, and if you're a nerd and you want to know more information about it, there is an Architect's Guide for triggering automation, so please take a look at it.
Yes, architect.salesforce.com, decision guides, guide to record triggered automation, go into a lot more detail than some of you might want, but for some of you, it's going to be a chance to nerd out, and it'll tell you a lot more about why this is this way.
Thank you.
That's awesome. All right, so if you're putting everything into one flow per object, we're going to recommend once you get to a certain scale or size of automation to start using subflows, or to always use subflows. These are a great tool to reuse automation and maintain consistency. So if you find yourself building out the same 5 elements over and over, or wanting to copy and paste between flows, then putting that into its own subflow is going to be the way to go. But also when you're doing this kind of overall pattern, potentially with a lot of branching decisions, we've seen some folks who just want to put everything into a subflow. So they make it very clear kind of each business case is called via its own subflow. For record-triggered information, though, you're probably going to want to pass in some of the special sauce we have in record-triggered flows for things like is changed or the triggering record data into your flow, and that's where we have some specific recommendations. So subflows allow input and output variables, and that's how you pass information into the subflow and then out of the subflow. I would say if you're not sure where to get started, the way you could do it is to create in your subflow an input variable that is of the type of object that you're doing, like account triggered flows. You make an account record variable, and then you pass in just $record. You can also, if you're doing an isChanged and update flow, you can pass in prior record as well, and then you can use that to build logic to say, prior record dot status field, does that equal the same thing as record dot status field in your subflow as well? So that's going to be kind of our overall best practice, but there's some reasons why you might not want to do that. If you're using that subflow in a lot of other places, you're calling it from screen flows, you're calling it from quick actions, a lot of other places, those don't always have the ability to pass in a loaded record like we do. And in that case, you'll pass in the record ID and then do a get records to get that record and then act on it inside. So this is something you'll probably want to do if you're reusing that subflow in more places. It might just result in an extra call if you're exclusively using it in record-triggered flows. And lastly, there's always just sort of narrowing it down. If you're building out a subflow that's kind of like a function, say it's taking 5 fields and outputting a roll-up number or something like that, then you can go in and create individual input variables for text, for Booleans, for numbers, and just sort of create an output variable. This doesn't scale well if you're going to try to access 20 different fields on the records, but if you're only using 1 or 2, then that's going to probably be the most efficient way to kind of get in and out of a subflow. So again, it'll depend on your use case, but these are some different strategies you can use. Something to watch out for. This is a best practice across all flows, but we see particularly comes up when you have these 1 flows per object and when you have a lot of logic that might be hiding in or repeating in subflows, and that's repeating your record operations. If I have an account-triggered flow that updates my related contacts, but I am doing that in 6 different subflows and I'm updating those same that group of contacts 6 different times, then that becomes a real performance bottleneck. When we talk to our support team, we sort of look at what AJ does with perf and kind of optimizing on the margins, but when we talk to real-world customers or they come through our support, this is often where the biggest cost savings are found, is they're already just repeating things that could be done once. So if you want to dive into this more, in our debug panel, we have some options to add additional data, and that can show you which elements are counting against some of those limits, like your SOCL or your DML statements, because that's going to be where, and then you can kind of go through your different flows and your different debugs to try to figure out where all of that data is going if you're not comfortable using Apex debug logs, which will also show you that information. And as always, we always just got to throw it in there. You may have heard this if you've attended any flow best practice session. Never ever put one of those pink elements in a loop. If you're building record-triggered flows, we have some additional functions for update-related records, so hopefully you shouldn't have to use loops at all unless you're doing something pretty advanced. For most basic use cases, anything you might do in Process Builder, all of that should be available to do without looping, but if you have to use a loop, don't put one of those pink ones inside. So that was 1 flow per object, but now what happens when we have many flows per object? Then there's a different set of considerations that we like to recommend and talk about. So the first thing is, how do I know what all these different flows are running on? And that's why we've built Flow Trigger Explorer. So this is a tool that lets you pick your object as well as your trigger, like update or create, and see all of the flows that are going to run in a specific scenario. But one of the tips that we actually got, not from inside Salesforce, but from folks in the community, is that this is a great place to start kind of operationally as you're adding, say, new automation. So if you're trying to decide, so if you have a lot of flows on an object, you're usually trying to decide, am I adding with my new business requirement to an existing flow, or am I creating a new one? So by going to Flow Trigger Explorer, you can look in, you can dive into different flows and see if you make that decision. And then if you do want to create a new flow, we have that new flow button. And what that's going to do is pre-populate your flow with that object and with that trigger that you were already looking at. So it saves you a couple clicks, and it really ensures that you're thoughtful at the beginning about where that flow is going. The other challenge that we hear about when you have multiple flows is, what if those flows have interrelated logic? So flow A changes a field, and then flow B is reading that field, and it's going to matter if that automation runs before or after each other. That's where we introduced flow ordering, and that's also available in Trigger Explorer. So Trigger Explorer is going to show you the order that all of these flows are going to run in, and there's that Edit Order button, which lets you drag and drop and reorder your flows if they're in the wrong order. And then we sort of handle all the metadata on the back end. You can also go in and manually edit that metadata if you're, say, an ISV partner or something who wants to get your ordering in here. But for most users, this is going to be a great tool to make sure in your organization things are being ordered appropriately. Next up, the most important thing when you have a lot of flows running on a particular object trigger is to really refine your entry conditions. We also get asked a lot about performance in a lot of ways, and we always like to say the fastest flow is one that doesn't run at all when it doesn't have to. And so the goal of having, say, 20, 50 flows on an object is not that every update means 20 or 50 flows are running, but that we're checking our entry conditions and saying, okay, we know what is happening in that change, and we're only running 1 or 2 based on what the user has actually initiated. So this is where it's really important to do user testing, to understand your behavioral patterns and think about functional testing, and really think about, in a particular common scenario, like changing the opportunity stage or something, how many flows are really running, and should those things be combined or split up? So that's going to be the place to start. Our entry conditions support both our condition builder, which lets you sort of pick field, set value, as well as formulas. Formulas are more powerful. They are a little slower to execute. So they're a little more cost, but they allow you things like access to related records and access to global variables. So don't shy away from using formulas, but if it's something you can do in the condition, then I would move it and do it in the condition builder, just because we have some more performance optimizations available to us there. But feel free to use both because they're both super powerful. Another thing that I think is important, and I will say this tripped me up for a while when I was first building record-triggered flows, so it takes a little getting used to, but it's really powerful once you understand it. And that's our when to run flows for updated records. We have that radio button, either every time the flow is updated or only when the specific changes happen. So the best way I have to explain this is an example. You have an automation that says, when we close an opportunity, when we win, we want to send a Slack message to the wins channel with like a hooray, you know, confetti, whatever. That sounds great. Now, if you set that in your entry conditions and you have every time checked, then imagine that opportunity. It's been closed as one, we send the confetti, and then finance comes along and changes and updates the value, or we fix a contact in there or some detailed information. The system looks at that and says, oh, this record was updated and it still says closed as one, so let's send another message to the Slack channel, which means you might get, you know, a dozen Slack messages sent to the channel after that opportunity was closed. If you change it to only when, we're only going to trigger that automation when that opportunity stage was not closed won, and then when this update made it closed won. So we know it's sort of switched. So this is usually pretty obvious if you're doing something like a notification, because your users are going to tell you really quickly. But I think this can happen at a more subtle layer if you're doing things like updating records, where you end up repeatedly updating a related field that's already been updated by a previous change just because you didn't go in and kind of switch this. So this is another way that you can watch efficiencies by making sure that you're only running that automation when a very specific kind of change is happening and not just when the state of the object is the way the entry conditions specify. All right, so that was talking a lot about our run immediately path. So that's a lot of our traditional use cases, like updating records, sending email alerts, chatter posts, things like that. But as we look to the future, we have a lot more coming that happens asynchronously. So the record has been triggered, the change has been updated, and we want to fire something off to happen on its own, independently. And this has a different set of considerations that I think it's important to start to absorb and learn. The first is understanding your use cases. So this can be a little bit of a new or different world, or is only applicable at certain times. The most common use cases we hear are just offloading things. We're able to have more flexible limits because we're not constrained by, we're already updating or triggering that record. So we have to, if we have a record on create, the user is going to be sitting there watching that dial spin until you finish all your automation and we close that transaction. Asynchronous flows are happening afterwards. So they see the new record, they can move on their way. and you can run additional automation afterwards. So that's a common use case. We also see mixed DML. This is one that comes up a lot. Salesforce platform doesn't allow you to edit user data or edit non-setup data and setup data at the same time. So you can't elevate your user permissions and delete all the records using those elevated user permissions at one time. So this allows you to separate them while still kind of keeping it in one flow. And lastly, in integrations and external callouts. We have an awesome new feature in Flow, HTTP callouts. We've also supported things like invocable Apex and external systems for a long time, so there's more and more ways to call these external callouts from within Flow, and those you're also going to want to do asynchronously. And a note on the first one, this crossed my inbox a few days ago. We had a customer who recently migrated from Process Builder to Flow, and they utilized more asynchronous features as well as the fast field updates we talk about, and they were able to see something like a 36% performance improvement on loading and saving their contact records just by sort of utilizing all these features. So Flow is definitely more powerful, and it's going to give you more tools to optimize and improve your both back-end performance and your users' experience when they're going through and doing this. So building asynchronously, I think, also requires a little bit of a mind shift. And the main thing to think about is it's a little bit like the mother bird pushing the bird out of the nest. When you're sending off an asynchronous transaction, that needs to be independent and kind of happen on its own. So we just talked about all the flows one flow per object with a lot of automation or breaking it up. When it comes to asynchronous, you want to break things up. You want things to be self-contained because they're going to kind of operate on their own independently. And so keeping them split up is really sort of an overall architectural or developer best practice that we recommend also following inside Flow. What this means, since they're sort of their self-contained things, is you have to decide and think about what kind of information you're passing in, a little bit like the subflows we talked about. So when you run asynchronously from Flow, we pass in the triggering record, so that dollar record is there with all that information. But if there's any other information that you want to pass or that maybe you were doing in the immediate path, you need to save that back to the database and re-access that from the asynchronous flow because it is, again, operating as its own independent unit. We're looking at ways in the future that we might be able to help you optimize that, but that might be a little ways off. So I think for now, that is definitely the way to go. So I also want to give an example of what this might look like when you're building out, particularly for those external callouts. Things get complicated. We often sort of say a best practice is don't mix your callouts and your DML together. You kind of hear things like that a lot. And I wanted to kind of flip that and say, okay, how should I design a callout, or what would be the steps to follow, and talk through that instead. So the first thing is kind of gather your resources. So what's all the data that you're going to need? So any get records you want to do, if you're passing in dollar record, all of that, kind of making sure you have all the equipment for your journey up front. Then that's the opportunity to do any pre-processing logic. If you've been able to try out our new transform element that's currently in beta, this is one of those things where you can kind of curate your CRM data into something that's going to be appropriate to, say, send to a call out over the wire on the web. You can also do other things, decisions, filters, things like that. And then you're going to want to do your call out. Then you can do, again, more post-processing logic. Those are any of those orange elements. So there's sort of a reason why things are color-coded in Flow or grouped, and those are all of our logic elements. So that's somewhere where you might make a decision, okay, based on what came back from that call-out, I might want to do A, B, or C. I might want to create a record or decide to update instead. I might want to fail and start over, all of those different things. So that's going to be where you do your post-processing. And then any DML or any create, updates, or deletes, you want those all at the end. So you're not mixing and matching those blue elements and those pink elements. That's kind of like how I like to think about it. And then maybe you want to do more automation afterwards. Maybe you want to do another call out. You kind of want to chain these together. I think at that point it's important to think about triggering another flow. So there's some different ways. You could trigger another record change flow, a platform event flow, but think about it in terms of doing that rather than trying to build one giant flow that does waits and pauses and things. There are some ways to do this. Again, we're talking kind of general best practices and not the global anything that's possible. So those of you out there who are longtime Flow users know there's ways to break the transaction and do things differently. So feel free if you're comfortable with that. We have some more advanced tools there. But I would say if you're getting started, this is a great kind of best practice pattern to follow. Grow your knowledge set, and then if you want to use those more complex ones, do that going forward. We have also kind of a bunch of other possible asynchronous things. So what I was talking about here is you have a record-triggered flow, and you choose, there's a little checkbox to run that flow asynchronously. But there's some other ways that are kind of related that you can do that in Flow or on the platform in general. One of these that, again, this is not something that I came up with. This is something that the community came up with, and we've sort of incorporated in. I think Michelle Hansen has a great Automate This video about doing it. Platform event flows. You can trigger those basically by doing a create records that will create the platform event record that you've already previously configured, and that's going to run independently. And so that can be a great way to sort of, I want to trigger something else to run elsewhere, somewhere else. I don't need it to kind of come back and process that information. So that's a great way to just kind of offload some logic. We also, as I mentioned, there are some ways to break up transactions by doing zero waits, where you put in a pause and then have the pause wait for 0 seconds. That's not necessarily recommended. That causes a lot of extra load on the server because we store that entire flow state and then we reload it back in. So we're kind of just doing this big lift and shift. So that is something that works at smaller scales, but it just tends to break down at larger scales. Again, there's still some use cases where that ends up being the solution. But if you were used to doing that in Process Builder and you're moving to Flow, this is a chance to look at running asynchronously instead. And lastly, we get asked, when should we use Apex? Flow does not do everything here, particularly when it comes to external callouts. I would say the number one thing that we hear about is error handling and retries, things like that. So if you're calling out to an external system and you're getting a lot of different codes returned and you want to retry and custom handle that logic, I think we have some things. If you've attended the Flow roadmap session, this is an area that we're looking to improve and build out in the future of Flow. But in terms of what you can go and do today, I think if you're running into that, that's going to be something where Apex is going to be better for today. And also we have that debug panel that I had that screenshot of. So if you want to see transaction boundaries, which is going to be those DML statements, that's what ends up kind of mixing and matching there, you can use that as well. All right, scheduling best practices. So this is also another world. So we have two different ways to sort of trigger on schedules. One of those is schedule triggered flows, and the other is scheduled paths, which is a sub feature of record triggered flows. I like to think of it as scheduled triggered flows are triggering on the calendar, right? If you were going in to your calendar and creating a reminder for yourself every Monday at 3 p.m., that's what scheduled triggered flows are for. Scheduled paths are going to be based primarily on data in your records. So they're looking at things like due date, renewal date, things like that, and allowing you to build logic around those dates. So sort of like database-based date fields, which is a horrible way to say it. If anyone has a really clever, pithy way to say that, let me know, because I'm still searching for it. But to start with scheduled flows. So scheduled flows have the ability to batch records. We have some sort of lightweight record batching, which allows you in the start node to run that scheduled flow on a set of contacts, maybe all the cases that are due today, or all the contacts that are missing sort of the last name field. Well, they wouldn't be listed last field, but that are missing a field. And you can set that to run at 2 a.m. You can set that to run repeatedly or weekly. One thing to keep in mind is that we then do all of that batching for you. So the flow that's running is running repeatedly on each record that's set in the start node. We've seen some real confusion around this, where people then put loops or additional kind of record operations inside the flow after they've configured the batch. And that's very similar to that putting the pink record inside the loop. And that can blow up very quickly. And that's another thing that's a common call to our support engineering team. So if you're configuring the batch in the start node, really limit any data elements that you're doing. Now, updating $record, right? The record, that's a really common one, so you should feel free to do things like that. But if you're going and getting a lot more records or updating a lot of related records, just know that you can hit limits pretty quickly. We cap the number of records you can use with this at, I think, 250,000 per day. And you can run into that very quickly if you wind up in these kind of repeatedly calling the same records over and over again. Another tip here is I mentioned we want to see if my case due date is today or something like that. A lot of that advanced logic isn't going to be possible to configure in that batch today, but what you can do is put a custom formula field on your object and then call that from your custom conditions. So you could do a custom formula field that says is case due today, and then inside flow you check is case due today equal to true, and that's going to be probably the most efficient way to check some more of that advanced logic. We're hoping to do more with that in the future, but again, we're looking at practical tips that you can take on today. So yeah, that's very important. This is something we've seen people do really incredible and powerful things with, but it's also a really common complaint in terms of scaling up or potentially running into those repeat operations. Check your warnings. We do put some warnings in there if we think you're kind of accidentally putting too many DML calls in there, but we don't catch everything. So it's an important thing to test and check. Forward-looking statement, we are trying to add more to debug so you know how many records that this is going to run against, and you can pick different records and see whether they'll apply or not apply, hopefully in the summer release. So we're trying to help you out here as well. Next up is scheduled paths. So scheduled paths are a way from within record-triggered flows to, again, trigger either based on the trigger date or more commonly to trigger based on record fields that are date time related. So things like your renewal dates, case dates, all of that. One thing, again, that was a community suggestion is to always put your scheduled paths into their own flows. We do allow you to kind of branch, and there are, again, some use cases where it can be helpful to have a lot of scheduled paths in one flow, but for maintenance reasons, it's often better to have them in their own. One thing is that you can name them differently, which means if they're showing up in your time-based workflow queue, or if there's something that's running, say it's, contractual renewal, you want to remind 1 month before. This could be something that's pending in the queue for 11 months. And so having a really clear label for what that is doing separately from your other flows is going to be really helpful. And it also means if there's an update to that flow, you're minimizing those changes, again, because these can be persisting for a really long time. So that's one of the things to think about when you're building scheduled paths. Record-triggered flows, they're happening in milliseconds, right? And then they're done. So if you make a change to them, they're just going to update kind of the next time someone makes an update to the record. But if you have a scheduled path that's pending for 6 months, 9 months, 2 years, it's more important to minimize the changes. We do handle those. We handle and we sort of reapply the new flow. So we'll handle some of that for you. But just for your testing purposes and peace of mind, I think they're better in their own flow. The other thing that's really important is to understand how we use those entry conditions that I talked about earlier that are in the start node of your record-triggered flow when you're doing scheduled paths. So what we do is we take those and we're rechecking those conditions as that object persists. So again, let's take that 1 month before renewal. We only want to run that on active accounts, right? If account gets made inactive or archived or something like that, we don't need to do that. So if you put those conditions in there to say only when account is active, then what we're doing on the back end is checking anytime that account status field changes, and we'll take it out of kind of the queue that's waiting. If it becomes inactive, we'll put it back in. If it becomes active, and we'll also do those readjustments if the date changes. So the renewal date gets pushed forward 6 months, we'll also be monitoring all of that for you. So you don't have to necessarily put in an additional decision at the time it's scheduled to make sure those things apply continuously, but keep those in your entry conditions. And so I think this sometimes takes a little bit of wrapping your head around, but it really can cut down on maintenance long term if you set that up correctly to begin with. We also have some different kinds of fields. So we show every date field that's on the record, including system modified ones like last modified. We have to support it for legacy reasons, but don't create scheduled paths off last modified. We have another date field in there that's sort of when the record was updated or created. If you want to run 5 minutes after that change happened, an hour after that change happened, you can also use scheduled flows to do that, or scheduled paths, excuse me, to do that. But don't go in and use sort of the created or last modified. Again, I've seen some people have creative solutions there, but it tends to be very costly on the server. If you do want to do that when the record was created or updated and use that trigger time to set your scheduled paths, feel free to do that. But we are going to require you to use that every time only when switch, to switch that to only when, because we don't want you kind of queuing up a scheduled path anytime the record gets updated. So we'll let you do that on something like create. So once you create, you can kind of do it again. But once you start doing create and update, again, that can get very sizable. So we're going to require you to use isChanged or something to really scope down your entry conditions just for that, not for the kind of date fields that are on your records. All right, so that was a little about scheduled flows and scheduled paths. But we also have best practices that I would say we always recommend. I put these in every presentation we do. And one thing is testing. We didn't get a chance to talk about it too much today, but test early, test often. We have the record trigger debug that can let you go through and test different kinds of updates and changes. So you can go in and say, is this flow gonna run if I change this record, if I change this field? But also I think it's important because there's a lot of automation happening, that debug is only going to run on your particular flow. If you want to test, again, that many objects pattern across a lot of things, you're going to have to be in a sandbox, and you're going to go through and do actual real-world changes to your records and then see what's run in your debug logs. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Next up, as I mentioned, sandbox, not production. Do not build your flows in production, especially record-triggered flows. These are things that I think it's important. If you build it once and you build it correctly, it's going to run millions of times. It's going to save your users so many hours of work, but it's worth it to take the time and test and invest that time up front to then run it kind of globally, potentially for years and years without touching it. So you will get that return on investment, but I think that's the way to think about it. Next up, documentation. I cannot tell you the number of people who, we all hate it. We all hate to document it, and we all hate to inherit an org or come into a new job and there isn't documentation. So it's sort of respect your future self and respect your future colleagues who might be showing up fresh and green, and think about how they are gonna look at this flow, understand it, wanna change it. It's one of the hardest best practices to actually internalize and do, but it is often the most important. And lastly is don't forget about your friends. Again, I built a lot of this presentation with input from community members, from engineers on our team, from our support team, from our customer success groups. So this really is a collaborative effort. There's an amazing community out there if you have questions. The Trailblazer community, we have an automation group, as well as a variety of other channels, the Automate This platform if you want to see hands-on demonstrations. So definitely reach out and ask for help. And also come back. If you think I missed something in here, if you think there's a burning best practice that I didn't include, come tell me afterwards, because this is sort of an evolving and living presentation. And as we hear things, we're able to kind of synthesize that and share that out with the wider community. So thank you so much. A reminder, you get a Starbucks gift card if you're one of the first to provide feedback, and it also really helps us to improve these presentations and our overall schedule in the future. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.